$412. That's what was left in the account my wife and I spent 12 years filling. I was standing in the parking lot of a hardware store in Lima, Ohio, with a roll of 12-gauge wire under my arm, looking at my phone like it had made a mistake. I refreshed it. Same number. I logged out and logged back in. Same number. 12 years. Every overtime Saturday. Every job I took in an attic in August. When the air up there was 130 degrees and my shirt weighed 5 pounds by noon. Every time Denise said, let's just stay in this weekend. And I said, yeah, let's stay in, because staying in was free, and free went into the box. That's what we called it. The box. It started as an actual shoebox in 2013, then it got too full and the bank version seemed safer. $412. I called her. She didn't pick up. I called again. She answered on the 4th ring, and I could hear music behind her, and a woman laughing, and somebody saying something about chair covers. I said, Denise, where's the money? And she said, in this voice like I'd asked her what time it was, she said, Rick, I told you about this. She had not told me about this. 3 weeks. That's how far we were from her sister's wedding. 3 weeks from a wedding I was not paying for. That's what I thought. That's what I believed, standing in that parking lot with wire under my arm and my truck ticking behind me in the heat. And then she said the thing I still hear at 4 in the morning when the house is quiet and I'm awake and I don't know why yet, and then I remember why. She said, she only gets married once. You had 12 years and you never took me anywhere. I stood there. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of it. I'm not a yeller. I've never raised my hand to anybody. I'm an electrician. I'm 48 years old. I fix things. That's the whole shape of me. Somebody says it's broke. I go look at it. I find where it's broke. I fix it. So I didn't yell. I said okay. I hung up. I drove home. And 9 days later, the man she was marrying my money to called my phone. Not to thank me. To ask me a question I couldn't answer. But I need to start way before that, because the money didn't disappear in 3 weeks. The money had been disappearing for 11 years, and I was the only person in that family who didn't know it. Denise and I got married in 2013 in the county courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon, because Tuesday afternoon was when the judge had room. She wore a blue dress she already owned. I wore the good shirt I kept for funerals and job bids. Her mother Carol came, and her sister Marissa came, and my buddy Dale came and stood up for me and then went back to work because he had a boiler down at the school. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Afterward, we ate at a diner on Alita Road, and I paid with a 20 and someone's, and we laughed about that, because that was funny then. That was the kind of thing that was funny to us. In the parking lot, she said, one day we're going to do this right. Somewhere with an ocean. I said, name the ocean. She said, Atlantic. She said she wanted to be somewhere she could hear it at night through a window. That was it. That was the whole dream. It wasn't Paris. It wasn't a cruise. It wasn't anything you'd put on a wall. She wanted a window and the sound of water. So we started the box. Here's how the box worked. Every job I did off the books, cash jobs, weekend jobs, panel swaps for old guys who wanted it done Saturday because they didn't trust anybody during the week, that money didn't touch the regular account. It went in the box. Every time somebody at a wedding handed us a card with 100 in it, box. When my mother died in 2016 and left me $11,000 and a truck that didn't run, I put every dollar of it in the box, and Denise cried, and she said your mother's paying for the ocean, Rick. I believed that for 10 years. Denise worked at a dental office, front desk, then office manager. She was good at it, better than good. She had this thing she could do where somebody would call in furious about a bill and she'd talk to them for 4 minutes and they'd hang up apologizing to her. I used to hear her do it from the kitchen. She could take a person apart and put them back together and they'd thank her for it. I thought that was the most impressive thing about her. It's funny what you find out later about the things you admired. We didn't have kids. That's a whole other story, and it's not this one, but it's why the box mattered so much. It was the thing we were building instead. Some people build a family. We built a number, and that number had a sound in my head. I'd be up on a ladder in some crawl space with fiberglass down my collar, and I'd think about that number, and it would get me to 5 o'clock. Life was small, and it was fine. We had a house we half owned. We had a dog named Chief who died in 2019, and neither of us wanted another one. We had Friday night at the Legion sometimes. We had her mother every other Sunday, which was a lot, but you take it. And we had Marissa. Marissa is 4 years younger. She's the pretty one, and I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because that's how the family said it, out loud at the table in front of both of them. Carol used to say it like it was weather. Denise is the smart one and Marissa is the pretty one. You say that to two girls for 20 years and you find out what it builds. Marissa never held a job past 14 months. She'd get one, and it would be great for a while, and then the boss was a jerk, or the drive was too far, or she got a better opportunity that never opened. She had a boyfriend named Kyle for a while who took her to Florida and then didn't. She had another one before that. She lived in an apartment in Delphos that I always thought was nicer than an apartment somebody with her job should have. I thought about that. Once or twice. Not hard. I'd say to Denise, how's your sister paying for that place? And Denise would say something like, oh, she's got roommates, or the landlord's a family friend. And I'd say, huh, and then I'd go back to whatever I was doing, because it wasn't my business and I had a panel to finish and a lunch to pack. That's the part I can't get past, if you want the honest truth. Not the money. The huh. 12 years of huh. In March of last year, Marissa got engaged. She called Denise at 9 o'clock at night and Denise put it on speaker and screamed. And I remember Marissa saying his name over and over, Trent asked me, and Denise was crying and laughing, and I was standing there in my socks in the kitchen holding a fork like an idiot, happy for them, actually happy, and I said something like, well, we better save up for a good gift. Denise looked at me. I didn't understand that look for about 6 months. But I understand it now. That look wasn't about a gift. That look was the look of somebody who already knew what this was going to cost me, and already knew she wasn't going to ask. The engagement dinner was at Carol's house in April. Carol lives in the house they grew up in, a little two-story on a street where every third house has a flag out front. She's 71. She's the kind of woman who calls you honey and means something else by it. She made a ham. She made it because Trent's family was coming, and she wanted to show something. And the something she wanted to show was that they were people who made a ham. Trent's people came in 2 cars. His dad owns a company that does grain bins, and his mother had a purse that cost more than my compressor, and I knew that because Denise told me later. She looked it up on her phone in the bathroom. They were nice. That's the thing. They were genuinely nice people. His mother complimented Carol's hydrangeas and meant it. And I watched Carol shrink about 2 inches over the course of that dinner, and I watched Denise notice. Somewhere between the ham and the pie, Trent's mother said something about the venue. Just conversationally. She said, we've got a place in mind out by the lake. It's beautiful. We did Trent's cousins out there. And Carol said, oh, we couldn't ask you to. And Trent's mother said, of course you could. Don't be silly. And Carol said it again. We couldn't ask you to. And she said it in a way that closed a door. I didn't hear it, I was eating pie, but Denise heard it, and Marissa heard it, and that whole thing between women that happens above the frequency I can pick up, that happened right across the table from me while I ate pie. On the ride home, Denise didn't talk for about 4 miles. Then she said, my mother is not going to have Trent's family pay for my sister's wedding. And I said, okay. That's it, that's what I said. Okay, like a man agreeing to a weather report. She said, they'll do it, and they'll be gracious about it, and every Christmas for 30 years Marissa will be sitting at a table remembering who paid. And I said, that's fair. I want to stop right here, because if you're listening to this and you're waiting for the part where I got played, this is it. This is the part. It wasn't a lie. Nobody lied to me. She told me exactly what she was going to do, in the truck, on Route 30, in April. And I said that's fair, because it was fair, and because it cost me nothing to say. And because I assumed, the way you assume the floor is going to be there, that when it came time to talk about actual dollars, somebody would talk to me about actual dollars. 2 weeks later, the dress happened. I found out about it the way you find out about a lot of things in a marriage, sideways. Denise was on the phone in the other room and I heard her say 3,200, and I heard her say it the way you say a number you've already made peace with. I asked her about it that night, standing in the bathroom, her taking her earrings out. I said, 3,200 for what? She said, the dress. I said, whose? She said, Rick. Just my name, that's all. And there was this whole sentence inside my name, and the sentence was, don't make me say it out loud. I said, out of the box. And she said, I'm putting it back. She said it fast. She said, I've got 2 commission checks coming, and I'm putting it back before you'd even notice. I just needed it now because the alterations take 14 weeks, and if we waited, we'd have paid rush. And here's the thing that gets me. That was smart. That was a good argument. That's a person who understands money making a reasonable operational decision, and I'm a guy who's used to being the one who understands money in the house. So when she talked to me like that, it kind of flattered me. It felt like a partnership. I said, okay, but that's a loan. And she said, absolutely. She looked right at me. She said, absolutely, it's a loan. I'll have it back by June. She never had it back by June. But that's not the part that matters either. The part that matters is what I did the next morning, which was nothing. I didn't open the account. I didn't look. Because I trusted her, and because looking would have meant I didn't. And I didn't want to be that guy who checks. My dad was that guy. My dad counted the change in my mother's purse. I swore to God I'd never be him. So I didn't look. For 4 more months, I didn't look. And in those 4 months, while I was up in attics doing what I do, my wife was doing what she does, which is take something apart and put it back together and have you thank her for it. Here's what a leak looks like when you don't know it's a leak. The dress was March into April. In May it was the deposit on the venue, because Carol had made the phone call, and the place out by the lake needed $6,000 to hold the date, and if you didn't hold the date it was gone until 2027. $6,000. Denise told me about that one after. She told me at dinner, casual, the way you'd mention a dentist appointment. She said, I moved some out for the venue hold. It comes back when Marissa's account clears. Marissa's account. I said, Marissa's got it? And Denise said, Marissa and Trent have it. Yeah, it's just tied up. Tied up. I want you to hear that phrase. I heard it maybe 40 times that year. Money that was tied up, money that was coming, money that was in a check that was in the mail that was going into an account that had a hold on it. Every single time, there was money that existed somewhere else, and the box was just the bridge. June, the photographer. $2,200. Also June, the band. $3,000, but that one Denise told me was half, and the other half was Trent's dad, and I remember feeling good about that. I remember thinking, see, everybody's chipping in. I remember doing the math in my head on a job site and thinking, we're maybe 11, 12,000 in, and it's coming back, and this is what family costs, and I've got a good wife who takes care of her people. July, the open bar. That's the one that woke me up a little. Open bar came to 8,400, and Denise didn't tell me. Carol told me on a Sunday on the porch with iced tea, and she said it like a compliment. She said, honey, an open bar. Marissa's beside herself. I said, an open bar. And Carol said, Denise says it's handled. Denise says it's handled. I sat there on that porch and I felt something turn over in my chest, and I still didn't do the thing. I still didn't take my phone out of my pocket. You want to know why? Because Carol was watching me. Because in that whole family I had exactly one role, which was the steady one, the son-in-law who's good with his hands and never makes a scene, and if I'd pulled that phone out on that porch I'd have been something else forever. So I drank the tea. I brought it up in the truck. I said, 8,400 for the bar? And she said, it's the last big one. I said, that's not what I asked. And she said, Rick, I'm handling it. And I said, out of the box. She looked straight ahead at the road and she said, where else? Where else? That was the first time she didn't dress it up. No loan, no coming back, no Marissa's account clearing. Just where else? Like I was slow, like I was asking where the water in the sink came from. I said, Denise, that money's got a name on it. And she said, yeah, it's got both our names on it. I didn't have an answer for that. That's the worst part. She was right. Legally, morally, in every way you could put on paper, she was right. It was her money. It was our money. I couldn't stand there and tell a grown woman she couldn't spend her own money on her own sister. So I found a different way to say what I meant, and I said it badly. I said, when's the ocean, then? And she went quiet, and we drove about a mile. And she said, that's not fair. I said, I'm not trying to be fair. I'm asking when's the ocean. She said, after. After. I let it go, because you let it go, because it's a Tuesday, and you've got a rough in at 7, and you're tired, and letting it go is free, and fighting costs you your whole evening, and probably your Wednesday too. We were fine after that. That's what people don't understand about a marriage going wrong. It doesn't go wrong loud. We were fine. We watched a show. She fell asleep on me on the couch. I carried her half awake up the stairs like I'd done 1,000 times, and she said something in my neck I didn't catch, and I said, That was August 9th. I know because I looked it up later. August 9th was also the day, according to the statement, I would eventually be holding in a parking lot with wire under my arm, that $11,500 left our account in a single transfer. Not to a venue, not to a band, not to a florist. To an account ending in 4471. And I would spend the next month of my life trying to find out whose that was. I want to tell you about the day I finally looked, because it wasn't brave. I want to be clear about that. I didn't look because I got strong. I looked because of a coupon. That's it. That's the whole reason. Menards had 11% back and I was going to buy a compressor I'd been putting off for 2 years, $600. And I thought, you know what? I've been good. I've been real good. I'm taking $600 out of the box for a compressor. First thing I'd ever taken out of it. 12 years, and the first thing I ever took out of that account for myself was a compressor. So I opened the app in the parking lot. $412. You already know that part. What you don't know is what I did for the next 40 minutes, which was nothing. I sat in my truck. I didn't turn it on. It was 92 degrees out, and I sat in a truck with the windows up, and I scrolled. Because the app only shows you 90 days. 90 days was enough. 90 days had the 11.5 to 4471. It had a 9,000 to 4471 in June that I'd never heard about. It had transfers going back as far as the screen would let me go, and every single one of them, the big ones, the real ones, weren't going to vendors. They were going to one account. 4471. And the little ones, the ones with names on them, the florist and the photographer and the cake place, those added up to maybe 19,000. But $41,000 had left that account. I'm not a math guy. I'm a load calculation guy, which is a different thing, but it's still numbers, and the numbers didn't sit. There was $22,000 that had left my life and did not show up at a wedding. So I called her, and she was at a fitting or a tasting or a something, with music behind her, and I asked her where the money was, and she told me she'd told me, and then she said the sentence. She only gets married once. You had 12 years and you never took me anywhere. I want to be honest about what that did to me, because I've had almost a year to think about it, and I've got it down to one thing. It wasn't the accusation. The accusation was even kind of true. I didn't take her anywhere. 12 years and I never took that woman anywhere, and that's on me. That's a real thing I did, and if she'd said it to me on any other day, I'd have taken it on the chin and probably booked something that night. It was that she had it ready. You understand? That was not a thing she thought of standing in a room with chair covers. That was a thing she'd built. That was load-bearing. She'd been carrying that sentence around for years, keeping it dry, waiting for the day I finally asked, and when I asked, she didn't have to reach for it. It came out finished. Which meant she'd always known this day was coming. Which meant she'd been ready for it the whole time she was telling me the money was coming back in June. I drove home. I want to tell you I did something. I didn't. I made a sandwich. I ate the sandwich standing up at the counter looking out at the driveway, and then I went out to the garage and I organized a drawer of fittings for about 2 hours, sorted them by size. My hands were fine. Steady as anything. She came home at 9:30. I heard her keys. I heard her set them in the dish. I heard her stop in the kitchen, and I knew she was looking at the plate I left in the sink, because that's how she was. She'd look at the plate. She came out to the garage door and stood there and said, "Are you coming in?" And I said, "Whose account is 4471? She didn't move. That's how I knew. A person who doesn't know just says, "What, honey, what number?" A person who doesn't know asks a question. She didn't ask a question. She stood in that doorway with the kitchen light behind her so I couldn't see her face, and she said, "Don't do this tonight." I said, "That's not a no." She said, "Rick, don't." I said, "I'm asking my wife whose bank account has $22,000 of mine in it, and she's telling me don't." And she said, "It's my sister's. There it is." I said, "Okay," and then I said, "Why?" And she said the second thing. The thing that was worse than the first thing, and I didn't even know why yet. She said, "Because it's always been my sister's." Then she went inside, and I stood in my own garage at 10 o'clock at night, 48 years old, with a drawer of fittings sorted by size, and I realized I had no idea who I'd been married to for 12 years. 9 days later, my phone rang. Number I didn't know, 419 area code. I almost didn't answer. He said, "Rick, this is Trent." And my first thought, God's honest, my first thought was that somebody had died. Because Trent had never called me. Trent and I had maybe 40 words between us total, spread over a year, all of them about trucks or the Browns. He's 33. Big kid, quiet, drives a Silverado he keeps too clean. The kind of guy who calls you sir the first 3 times and then stops because you tell him to. I said, everything okay? And he said, yeah. And then he didn't say anything for about 4 seconds, which on a phone is a year. Then he said, this is going to be a weird question. I said, go ahead. He said, my mom got a call from the venue. There's a balance. I sat down. I was in the driveway. I sat down on the tailgate. I said, how much? He said, $7,200. And they said it's been outstanding since June and they've called 4 times and left messages with, and he stopped and I could hear him deciding, and then he said it. He said, with Denise. The venue had been calling my wife for 2 months about $7,000 that was not paid. I said, Trent, I need you to say that again. He said it again. And then he said the part that took the floor out. He said that's not the only one. The band's asking. The rentals place, the chairs, and the tent. They want a card on file before Thursday or they don't deliver. My mom's been quiet about it because she doesn't want to make it weird, but she's got about 11 grand of it on her own card right now just to keep the thing from falling apart, and she won't say anything to Marissa. And I don't know how to ask this. And then he asked it. He said, is your family broke? Is that what's happening? Because if that's what's happening, my dad will just pay it. Nobody has to know. I just need somebody to tell me the truth so I can fix it before my wedding. Is your family broke? You want to know what I did? I laughed, out loud on the tailgate alone in my driveway, just once. It came out of me like a cough. Because that poor kid had spent 2 months thinking his in-laws were poor and too proud to say it, and he was calling to quietly bail us out, and he was apologizing to me while he did it. I said, Trent, we're not broke. I put $41,000 into that wedding. Nobody said anything. I could hear his truck. He was driving. I could hear the blinker going, and then it stopped, and then it went again. He said, Rick, that wedding costs 26. 26. He said it again like I was slow, and he wasn't being rude, he was being careful, he was reading numbers off something in his head. He said 26, all in, that's the venue, the food, the bar, the band, everything. Marissa did a spreadsheet. My mom's got a copy of the spreadsheet. 26. I said, that can't be right. He said, the venue's 12. The bar was quoted at 5,500. 5,500. Carol told me 8,400. Denise told me nothing. Somebody, somewhere told me 8,400 and took 8,400 and paid 5,500 and kept the difference. And even that wasn't the real number. Because the real number was $22,000 I could not find. I said, Trent, do me a favor. Don't pay anything else. Not $1. And don't tell your mother anything yet. He said, okay. He's a good kid. He just said, okay. And then he said, Rick, is Marissa okay? That question is going to stay with me longer than the money. Because he wasn't asking about a bank account. He was asking about the woman he was going to marry in 12 days. And there was something in the way he asked it that told me it wasn't the first time he'd wondered. That there'd been other things. Little things. A car payment she was vague about. A phone call she took outside. I said, I don't know. I said, I think I'm about to find out. And I hung up and I sat on that tailgate until the motion light gave up on me and went out. $22,000. It was never for a wedding. The wedding was just the first thing big enough that I finally noticed. The bank opened at 9. I was there at 8:40. They can print you 7 years. Did you know that? I didn't. You just ask. You sit at a desk with a woman named Angie who has a picture of a boat on her monitor and you say I need everything. And she says, sure, honey, how far back? And you say all of it. It took 19 minutes. She had to change the paper. I took that stack out to my truck and I sat in the bank parking lot from 9:15 in the morning until almost 2 in the afternoon, and I went through it with a pen from the bank and I did what I do. I found where it was broke. You want to know what I found? The first transfer to 4471 was March 9th, 2014. 14, not last year, not the wedding. 10 months after we got married in a courthouse in our good clothes and ate at a diner, and I paid with a 20 in someone's. $400, March 9th, 2014. Then May, 600. Then August, 400. Then a stretch of nothing, and then 2015 it's monthly. 350, 400, 350. Like rent. Because it was rent. That apartment in Delphos I always thought was too nice, that was mine. I paid for that. I paid for that apartment for 6 years while I was in an attic in August with fiberglass down my shirt. 2016, my mother died. $11,000, box, the ocean, your mother's paying for the ocean, Rick. $1,400 out that October. $2,200 out that December. There's a car in 2017, not the whole car, $9,000 of a car. There's a stretch in 2018 and 2019 where it stops almost completely, and I sat in that truck trying to think what happened in 2018, and then I remembered. Kyle. The Florida boyfriend. Marissa had somebody paying for her for 18 months, so the tap turned off, and I remember that being a good year. I remember 2018 being a really good year for us. We put in the back deck. I built it myself. Denise brought me a beer out there on the first night, and we sat on it, and she said, "We're doing okay, aren't we?" And I said, "Yeah, we're doing okay." The tap came back on in June of 2020, and then it never stopped again. I added it up 4 times because I kept not believing it. I did it on the back of a Menards receipt, and then on the back of a different one because I ran out of room. $63,480. 11 years. That's not counting the wedding. That's before the wedding. The wedding was just the year the leak got so big I finally heard it running. I sat there with my mother's money in that column. That's the one that got me. Not the 63,000. 11,000 of my mother, who cleaned houses, who never went anywhere either, who told me 2 weeks before she died that she was glad I found somebody who saved. That woman's money went to a lease on a Nissan in Delphos, and I never knew, and now she never will. I put the pen down, and I couldn't get my hands to do anything for a minute. Then I drove to Carol's. She was on the porch. Of course she was on the porch. She's always on the porch. She had the iced tea. She had the tone. She said, "Honey, what a nice surprise." And I put the stack on the little table between the chairs, and it made a sound. I said, "Carol, how long have you known?" And this is what she said. I want you to hear it exactly, because I've turned it over 100 times and I still can't make it into anything but what it is. She said, "Known what?" Not a lie, not a dodge. She said, "Known what?" and she meant it. She genuinely meant it, because in that woman's head there was nothing to know. There was no secret. There was just how the family worked, the way water runs downhill, and nobody calls a plumber about it. I said, "Denise has been giving Marissa my money for 11 years. And Carol picked up her tea, and she took a drink, and she set it down, and she said, "Denise takes care of her sister. She's always taken care of her sister. That's just Denise." And I said, "Carol, $63,000. And she said, "Well, honey, that's between you and your wife." And she smiled at me. I want to be careful here. I didn't hate her in that moment. I've thought about it, and I know that sounds like a lie, but I didn't. What I felt was something closer to what you feel when a house is wired wrong. Not anger. Just the sick understanding that it's been like this since it was built, that it's been like this the whole time you were living in it, and that the only reason it hasn't burned down yet is luck. And then Carol said one more thing. She didn't mean to. I really don't think she meant to. She said, "And after everything Marissa gave up for this family, Denise was never going to say no. You know that." And I said, "What did Marissa give up?" And Carol's face changed. That was the first time in 12 years I ever saw that woman look scared. Carol wouldn't tell me. She got up, 71 years old, and she got up out of that chair like she was late for something, and she said she had to get the roast on at 3 in the afternoon, and she went in the house and shut the screen door between us. So I sat on that porch alone for a second like an idiot, and then I got in my truck. And I drove to Delphos. Marissa opened the door in sweatpants with her hair up and a mask on her face, one of those green ones, and when she saw me she said, "Oh my God, Rick," and then she saw my face and she stopped saying anything at all. I said, "Can I come in?" The apartment was nice. That's what I kept thinking, standing in it. It was nice. There were candles. There was a big framed picture of her and Trent at some lake. There was a whole life in there and I had paid for a lot of it, and she had no idea I hadn't known that. That's what I figured out in about 90 seconds, and it changed everything. She thought I knew. She'd thought it for 11 years. She said, sitting on that couch with that green mask still on her face, because she'd forgotten it was there, she said, "Denise always said you were fine with it. Denise always said you were fine with it." She said, "She told me you said family's family." She said, "Rick, I've been thanking you." In my head. Every month. I sent you a Christmas card in like 2019 that said thank you for everything. Do you remember that? I remembered that card. I remember thinking it was a strange card. And I watched a 38-year-old woman figure out, in real time, sitting in front of me, that she'd spent a decade being taken care of by a man who never agreed to it. She got up. She went into the kitchen. She ran the water. She came back with the mask off, and her face red, and she said, "I'm going to be sick." And then she told me why. She said, "Has she told you about Dad?" Their father died in 2003. That's all I ever knew. Denise never talked about him, and I never pushed. Because you don't push. And because I figured a dead father is a closed room and you knock once, and if nobody answers you go do something else. Marissa said, "Dad had a stroke in 1999. He lived 4 more years. Somebody had to be home." She said, Denise was at Ohio State. 2nd year. And Mom sat both of us down and said one of you is going to have to come home, and she said, and Marissa stopped and made this sound that wasn't a laugh, and she said, and Mom looked at me. She said, "I was 17. I said okay. I said okay, because I was 17 and my mother was looking at me. 4 years, she wiped a man who couldn't talk. She was 17, 18, 19, 20. Her whole friends group went to college and she stayed in that 2-story house on that street with the flags and turned her father every 2 hours so he wouldn't get sores. And Denise finished her degree, and Denise got the job at the dental office. And Denise met me. Marissa said, "I've never held a job because I never learned how to have one." She said it flat. She said, "I don't know how to do a Tuesday. Nobody ever taught me a Tuesday. I learned how to take care of a dying man and then he died and I was 21 and I didn't know anything." And Denise knew. Denise knew exactly what got traded and who paid, and that she got the degree and the job and the husband and the house with the deck, and her sister got a bedroom with a hospital bed in it and no idea how to be a person. So Denise paid. Every month. For 20 years. 400, 350, 9 grand of a car, 11,000 of my dead mother's money, $63,000, and it was never charity, and it was never even really about Marissa. It was a debt. And here's the part that took me the longest to get to, and it's the part I want you to hear, because if you're in something like this right now, it's probably true for you too. She never told me because if she told me, I'd have had to agree. And if I agreed, then it wasn't hers anymore. And she needed it to be hers. That debt was the only thing keeping her from being the sister who got out. As long as she was paying it, she was still in it, she was still one of them, she hadn't left. Every $400 was her saying I didn't get away with it. She wasn't stealing from me. She was buying her way out of a room she'd been standing outside of since she was 20 years old. She just used my money to do it, for 12 years, and let me build a deck and talk about an ocean while she did. I drove home. She was at the kitchen table with a seating chart. Little paper squares. She looked up. And I said, "Tell me about 1999. She put the pen down. That's all she did for a long time. She just put the pen down and looked at those little paper squares with everybody's names on them, and the refrigerator was making that noise it makes, and I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and waited. Then she said, "Who talked to you?" "Not what? Not I don't know what you mean. Who?" And I said, Everybody talked to me, Denise. Trent talked to me. Your mother talked to me. Your sister talked to me sitting on a couch I bought. Everybody in this family has talked to me in the last 2 weeks except you, and you've had 12 years. And she said, I was going to. And I said, when? And she said, after. After. Same word as the ocean. I said, $63,480. She flinched. That was the first crack. Because she didn't know the number. That's the thing. She'd never added it up either. Nobody adds it up. You don't add up a thing you're doing $400 at a time in the dark for 20 years, because the number would tell you what you're doing, and then you'd have to stop. She said it a couple times under her breath. 63. And then she cried. And I want to be honest, because this is where I could tell you I stood there like a stone, and I went and I sat down. I sat down at that table with the paper squares, and my wife cried in front of me for about 10 minutes, and I didn't touch her and I didn't leave. And when she could talk, she said, I was in a dorm room. She said, my mother called me in a dorm room, and I heard her ask, and I heard my sister say okay, and I was so relieved I threw up. She said, I was 19, and I was so happy it wasn't me that I threw up in a bathroom on the 4th floor of a dorm, and then I went to class, Rick. I went to class. I got a B+ that semester. She said, and I never went back. 4 years her father took to die, and she came home for 2 Christmases and 1 funeral. And she looked at me and she said, what was I supposed to do? And it wasn't an argument, she was actually asking. And that's when I understood I'd been married to a 19-year-old for 12 years. Physically she was 44, and she ran an office and she could talk an angry man out of a bill in 4 minutes. But there was a 19-year-old in there in a bathroom on the 4th floor who never got out, and every single dollar was her trying to buy that girl a ticket home. I said, "You could have told me." And she said, "And then what?" And I said, "Then I'd have said yes." She stopped. I said, "Denise, do you understand that? If you told me in 2014, sitting right here, if you'd said, 'Rick, my sister gave up her whole life, and I let her, I need to send her $400 a month for the rest of my life,' do you know what I would have said? I'd have said okay. I'd have said let's make it 5. I'd have picked up more Saturdays. That's what I do. That's the only thing I know how to do. Somebody says it's broke, and I go fix it." And she was shaking her head, and she was crying, and she said, "I know, I know, I know." And I said, "Then why?" And she said it. Quiet. Not even to me, really. She said, "Because then it would have been ours. And it was supposed to cost me something." There it is. That's the whole thing. 12 years in one sentence. It was supposed to cost her something, and it never did. It cost me. It cost my mother. It cost an ocean nobody ever heard. I said, "It didn't cost you anything, Denise. That's what you don't get. You never paid $1 of it. I paid it. You just gotta feel like you paid it." She didn't say anything. And I got up, and I went out to the garage, and I sat out there, and this time I didn't sort anything. The wedding was 11 days later. I went. I want to tell you why I went, because Dale asked me, and I couldn't answer him then, and I can now. I went because Trent asked me to. That kid, 12 days before his wedding, holding $11,000 of his mother's money on a credit card, called me and asked me if his family was okay. He deserved somebody in that building who knew everything and showed up anyway. 3rd row, left side. Good shirt, the funeral one. Marissa came down that aisle and she was beautiful and my chest hurt and I couldn't tell you which thing it was hurting about. Denise cried through the whole thing. Real crying. She meant every second of it. And I sat in a chair I rented, in a room I paid for, next to my wife, watching her sister get everything, and I felt nothing at all. Not anger. Nothing. Like a breaker had thrown somewhere in me, and the whole wing just went dark and quiet. That was Saturday. Monday morning, I did the only thing I've ever done that I'm actually proud of. I went to the bank. Same bank. Angie with the boat on her monitor. And I opened an account. That's it. That's the whole thing. One account my name, nobody else's. And Angie asked me a question, standard, off the sheet. She wasn't trying to do anything to me. She said, "And would you like to add a joint owner today?" And I heard myself say no. And then I sat in that chair and I couldn't breathe right for a second because I was 48 years old and I had just, for the first time in my entire adult life, opened a place to put my own money that wasn't for somebody else. Not for a wife. Not for a box. Not for an ocean I was going to earn the right to hear. Fine. I'd never had one. Not once. I went from my mother's house to a marriage, and in between there was nothing but jobs. 52 Saturdays a year for 12 years, and I never once had $1 with my name alone on it. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because if you're listening to this, and you've got somebody at home, and everything you've got is a we, and it feels like love, I need you to just check. Just look. Not because they're stealing. Probably they're not. But there's a difference between building something together and disappearing into it, and I couldn't tell those two apart for 12 years. If you've made it this far with me, you already know this isn't really about the money. If this is landing somewhere, go ahead and subscribe. I've got more of these, and honestly, the people who stay to the end of one of these are the ones I'm talking to anyway. Here's what happened after. I didn't file for anything. I want to say that because I know some of you want that ending, and I don't have it for you. I didn't take her to court. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't put her things on the lawn. She's not a monster. That's the part nobody wants. She's a scared kid who did something at 19 she couldn't live with and spent 20 years paying a bill with my hands. We went to a woman in Findlay who charges $140 a session. Denise found her. Denise made the call, and I want that on the record too, because that mattered to me more than any apology. And in the third one of those, the counselor asked her something, not me. I was just sitting there. She said, "Denise, when Rick was in an attic on a Saturday, who was he in your mind?" And Denise said, "My husband." And the woman said, "No." She said, "Was he family?" And I watched my wife open her mouth and nothing came out. She sat there, 8 seconds. I counted because I count things, that's what I do. And then she said, I don't know. She didn't lie. God, she could have. She's the best I've ever seen at making a person feel good about a hard answer. She could have talked her way out of that room in 4 minutes and had all three of us thanking her. She said, I don't know. That's my climax. That's the whole thing I got out of 11 months. Not the money. I'm never seeing that money. Marissa can't pay it, and I'd never take it if she could. Not an apology. I got one of those, and it was fine. Apologies are cheap. Everybody's got one. I don't know. Because at least that was true. And I'd been living inside 12 years of things that were true enough, and true enough turns out to be a different thing entirely. We're still in the house. That's where we are right now, if you're wondering. Same house, same deck I built in 2018. And some nights it's fine, and some nights I look at her across a room and I can see the whole distance. The Nissan's gone. Marissa's got a job at a warehouse in Van Wert doing inventory, 14 months so far, which is her record, and she called me at Christmas and cried on the phone, and I told her it was alright, and I meant it. And here's the thing that surprised me, that was the easiest forgiveness of my life. She never took anything from me. She just got handed things by a sister who never told her where they came from. Trent's mother got paid back, not by me. Denise took a second job on weekends at a dental urgent care in Finlay, and she paid that woman back $11,000 in 7 months, and I never asked her to, and I never helped, and that's the closest thing to hope in this whole story. And the account with my name on it has $4,100 in it. It's not an ocean. It's not going to be an ocean for a while. But last month I drove out to Indian Lake by myself on a Sunday, and I sat in the truck with the window down and I could hear the water. It's not the Atlantic. It's water. So that's it. That's the whole thing. If you've been in this, and I know some of you have, tell me one thing in the comments. Not what I should have done. I know what I should have done. I should have looked in 2014. Tell me this instead. How much of your money has a name on it that isn't yours? And how long has it been that way? Go count it tonight. Then come back and tell me. And subscribe. Because next week I'm going to tell you what happened when my wife's mother finally showed up at my door.